Okay, so make sure that that's not. I think we're good. Is it? Okay, I was just making sure this page wasn't. Okay, so welcome to Reactionary Play. This is going to be a new type of show that Kelsey and I are going to be doing. You can see our Twitters at the bottom. I'm Froskurinn, joined by Kelsey Moser from The Score, and the idea of the show is to give a very quick overview of the LPL kind of day by day rather than, what China Talk does, which is a larger, in-depth show at the end of every week that kind of encompasses all of the weeks. It's going to be focused more on analysis and, again, just really getting Kelsey's perspective from this, as during the show I'm going to act in a hosting position. So, hi, Kelsey. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing all right. First day of LPL, very exciting.
Yeah, it was something. So, let's just break right into it. So our very first day of LPL, the format has changed now. Kelsey, can you kind of quickly give us an overview of the new format with the two different groups?
Yes, so right now it's a conference-style format where you have 6 teams in one group and 6 teams in the other group. And teams within Group A will play each other twice. Teams within Group B will play each other twice, but teams will play from Group A will play teams from Group B only once. And it's set up so that the first leg is only teams within the same group playing together. The second leg is only teams playing each other from opposing groups. And the final leg is only teams, again, playing each other. And it's also now best of 3 instead of best of 2.
And that's the big thing that I wanted to kind of touch on, is this idea that the format and the point system has changed from a set of 2 to a best of 3, and no longer is it, 1 point or 3 points. It's a single point for winning the entire series. Also, seeding has changed a little bit, but we don't have to get into that. Today, I believe it was Group B that played or started?
Yes.
EDG, is in Group B. So we had Group B play today. Now LPL runs for 4 days, which means that the show will have 4 shows per week. Again, just to review at the end of every single day. The 2 sets that we had tonight were EDG versus RNG and OMG versus VG. So let's start with EDG versus RNG, which was actually a 2-0 in favor of RNG. So first and foremost, I have to ask you, Kelsey, did you expect this type of result?
No, I actually did expect Edward Gaming to win.
But naturally, there's conditions to how RNG won. Just like when we say, ever beat SKT in the Kespa Cup, there were conditions to that victory. So what were the conditions for RNG to take this 2-0 over EDG?
Well, first of all, very first game, Edward Gaming were playing with both of their main subs, which are Athena from Ever, since you mentioned Ever, and Fire Lolly, who's
Imagine
been...
that. Threw you that nice little softball.
who's been on Edward Gaming in sort of a mascot-like streamer position for a long time instead of Clear Love.
And, just looking at... Okay. I think it's fair to say, if you watch the games, which if you guys don't go back and watch, the big detriment for EDG was specifically Fire Lolly, at least in my opinion. Would you agree?
I think that's accurate. I think in general the team just seemed less together, but if you go back to the very strict leadership position that Clear Love has, I think that makes a little bit more sense as well.
And definitely didn't have the greatest score lines there for Fire Lolly. I think his first game he was like 1-6 or something like that.
Yes.
So obviously an unfortunate start for his kind of career into the LPL. Is kind of the official. Clear Love made the comment in his interview that he wanted Fire Lolly to put pressure on him to kind of be more of an official sub as opposed to a mascot like you were talking about before. But the bigger thing that I wanted to hit on is this idea of, was it just Fire Lolly, or was there something bigger going on? You kind of mentioned that they looked a little bit lost. Clear Love is their primary shot caller. Was it Fire Lolly compounding on the fact that they didn't have their shot caller? Were there issues in draft? Because they also ran a very particular draft in both games.
Yeah, I think they had some strange picks and bans. Let me see if I can pull up the draft real quick.
I believe that they played Graves, Corky, and Ezreal, a triple 80 carry composition
Right.
with Tom Kinch and Trumdle. So the idea is that it's a poke kite composition with disengage from pillar, as well as the safety net that Tom Kinch can allow by gobbling people up and repositioning them around the map. So it was effectively a siege composition in the
Right.
LPL. Now, are EDG known for running siege comps?
No, Edward Gaming is much more aggressive and all in, and in fact, in the second game, we saw some parts where they were trying to be very aggressive and just engage really hard instead of kiting, which it was more suited to in the second game when they had Corki and Ezreal.
So, I mean, obviously they have a new coaching staff. Aaron was promoted more into a management head coach position, and they picked up Rapid Star and Firefox. To my understanding, Firefox was responsible for tonight's draft. Do you think that this is a drafting issue from, the new coaching staff, or is this something indicative of EDG maybe wanting to experiment this direction? Because obviously you do have comfort champions in there like Ezreal and Corki, which Pawn and Deft have played in the past.
Was Firefox on stage? Because it's my understanding he's working much more with their LSPL team.
I was told from some of our Korean connections that Firefox was the one responsible tonight because Rapid Star had just arrived in China.
I see. Because I thought I saw Rapid Star on stage. Anyway, it's kind of irrelevant. I think regardless, you are seeing, and when we talked about this a little bit on China Talk, we said that maybe Aaron stepping back wouldn't have as large of an impact because of the way that Clearlove works within the infrastructure as a team leader, and he's very strict and he really backs up and reinforces some of the coaching things that happen. So I think if you remove both of them from the equation, you're going to see a much more scattered Edward Gaming because the two of them have always really been the core of what made that team so successful.
Okay. I want to talk about, again, kind of going back to the composition before we move on from this topic. You've spoke out a lot about what defines like a Chinese team. When teams say Invictus Gaming at Worlds say, well, we started playing like a Chinese team, or, they play like a Chinese team. Most people seem to think that insinuates aggression, over-aggression, tower diving, things like that. What does that mean to you specifically? And does this composition and this style fit into that meaning?
You mean the kiting compositions, or?
Just, yeah, in specific, this kiting comp, but first and foremost, how would you define like a Chinese style or a Chinese composition?
Well, the way Kakao defined it in this interview that you're referencing was Chinese teams tend to play a lot more all-in, and a very key aspect of the Chinese mentality is kind of YOLO or styling on someone if you're really far ahead, which is why you see like these really questionable moves sometimes. So that has definitely been interwoven within their play. I think that it isn't always part of their style to just jump in at the first moment's notice, because we've seen a lot more patient teams like 2014 Edward Gaming, like older WE, that stall out games and team fight later. But I think that something that I would define as a key aspect of a Chinese team is kind of the integration of team fighting into the way things work. And that doesn't necessarily always work with a poke comp. I think you can make it work. We have seen some teams run successful poke comp. Some really big team fighting Chinese teams like Snake last year actually had a really interesting poke comp with Nidalee and Xerath in spring. So I think that it isn't necessarily contrary to what we think of as the Chinese identity. Also, what I would call part of the Chinese identity is sort of experimenting against the grain. So something that doesn't necessarily make the most sense within the context of the patch, but can just surprise teams anyway. So
you're talking about like a gimmick?
Not necessarily a gimmick, but perfecting a type of style that's unique to a specific team and just getting extremely good at it, so that when it does come to international competition, people think, oh, well, that's not very good, it's not going to work, and then it does anyway, just because they're good at it, or it's
like
surprising.
Starhorn Royal Clubs protect the 80 carry style.
Yeah, to an extent.
The QG Reapers jungle peel style.
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that we saw any sort of... the picks, we were on 5.24, just like LCK, right, were pretty common across all of the games. There was some Poppy, Quinn, Graves, jungle stood out. Do you see any of these picks or any of that emerging style over the 4 teams that we saw tonight?
Yeah, I think that we're going to see, especially in the initial weeks, different regions emphasize or prioritize different picks and drafts. In the LCK games that I've seen, we haven't really seen any Poppy. We haven't really seen any Graves jungle. We haven't seen any Quinn top. So I think that we're seeing a little bit of the Chinese take on how the patch is developing and what champion picks are important.
All those champions seem to prioritize aggression. I mean, obviously, you have a lot of dueling champions there. Poppy, maybe not so much, although I definitely think that she has that capability in her kit. But a
Yeah,
lot of
I think.
split pushing is what we've seen also,
Mhm.
kind of out of tonight's games. Do you think that that's going to be something that the other Chinese teams are going to kind of extrapolate and push forward?
I think that right now, if you're playing something like the fact that in the mid game or the early game, the only real objectives on the map are the turrets that
Yep.
are having a lot of relevance because I think Rift Herald, you have to invest too much time into taking it for it to really be worth it. Dragon, games aren't going long enough for you to build the 5 dragons. So people are just really, and turrets are also a little bit, they have less durability, they're easier to take. So people are just really emphasizing the turrets. So split pushing is becoming very popular. And if you're using a champion like Fiora or Quinn, like we saw today, then that's going to be really, really successful if you can get that champion kind of off the ground. So we're still seeing a lot of top lane emphasis uh, instead of what a lot of people thought would happen, which is just all about the bot lane, especially in the LPL.
Okay, so you're saying that there's emphasis on the structure, so we're seeing more champions that are adept at pushing down structures, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Or
so
dueling to take the structure after.
what do you think of the fact that EDG pretty much lost RNG by really poor objective identification in terms of, I mean, it was a structure focused game. Both teams pretty much had siege compositions. RNG also had a Tristana available to them as well as the Quinn, and then you had the triple AD carry comp coming out of EDG. And the game came down to a 5v5 over Baron. So obviously, I completely agree that they're setting up their teams because they understand the value of structures, and so trying to draft to compensate for going after what should be the best way to play the game. But then it comes down to the classic LPL single fight over Baron. I mean, does that say that LPL kind of learned from their mistakes that they made on the world stage, or do you think that we're still seeing the exact same LPL that we saw in 2014, that we saw in 2015, that we're going to see in 2016? Or do you disagree?
I think, well, two points to that. One is that if you look at the tower counts at the end of those games, you had like 10-1 in the first game and 8-0 in the second game. So EDG just weren't prioritizing towers at all,
Despite having a
which,
siege comp?
yeah, which was again really they had no idea what to do with their composition. And Royal Never Give Up, they started taking the tower turrets earlier. So even though maybe the gold wasn't super close by the time they got to Baron, they had advantages in map control. They had advantages just in a slight advantage in gold. Just these sorts of things from having taken those extra structures.
Yep.
Also, talking about the Barons, since we don't have a lot of early game objectives that really give you this big gold injection or this big power play, I think a lot of and Barons are being taken earlier at like super just the way they started to be taken in some of the European and Chinese games, which is close to 20 minutes last year. I think it's going to become much more the norm because Baron will really, really swing the game for you.
Likewise, it also has a global gold value attached to it.
Exactly. So it suddenly gives you this very big gold injection that's maybe disproportionate to the time at which we're starting to see it taken more often. So teams that, and also the death timers that result from Baron, the fights that typically go around Baron are going to
Mid-game.
make it
Yep.
a lot easier for people to take even more objectives after that. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of games determined by whoever gets the first Baron, honestly.
Okay.
So.
And kind of like last two questions before we move on to the next set of OMG versus Vici. Specifically, I want to talk about RNG and kind of focus a bit more onto them. Obviously, this is the first ever isolation that we ever have of Mata and Dandy. RNG has a 10-man roster. So the first question goes to RNG had a very similar style, I would say, in terms of their vision control to what we saw from Vici last split, or even some, Samsung White-esque type of maneuvers going on, and that anytime Mata gained information of where Fire Loli was, the enemy jungler, he would move in for some deep vision. You talked about how RNG, pushing down those early towers, opening up the map, it really helped Mata grab that oppressive vision control. They were pretty much always on top of that, opening up these picks, those mid-game death timers that you were talking about that are so punishing, that allow for these very easy objectives like towers, like Barons to be sieged. Do you think that it's simply Mata who's kind of controlling, like, what are the key aspects of RNG which makes them victorious? Because Looper also had an incredible set on both champions, Poppy and Quinn. Xiaohu didn't look terrible. Endless played his job really well. Xiaohu was just kind of a footnote, I guess. I wouldn't
Yeah.
say that he was the primary enabler despite having an enabled champion. So what do you think are the key points of RNG's success? And where do you actually place RNG now that we've seen them against EDG? Obviously, again, it comes with conditions that it was without Clear Love, it was with Fire Loli, but where do you rank them in terms of LPL?
Right. And I think just a quick caveat, we are seeing most of the mid laners in the games tonight, even like the really good ones like Pawn or Easy Hoon, were more like facilitators
Yep.
within their role, within the way that teams are working right now. I would say that where I rank them within the LPL, it's hard to say. When I looked at them before going into the games, I kind of said fifth because I think we're going to see some really exciting teams from Group A, and I think that Edward Gaming, if they have like stronger leadership, if they stop picking compositions that they don't understand, or if they start to understand the compositions they're picking, will ultimately still be the strongest team. We'll see if that ends up being wrong, but I think that they're probably around fourth or fifth, depending on what kind of form Snake is going to be in and what kind of form QG Reapers are going to be in.
Okay. And then RNG, what do you think are the kind of key components to their success? At least in the set that we saw tonight against EDG.
I think that, first of all, we started to see MLXG become more confident towards the end of summer, around week 10, and that sort of progressed more. He still will have a little bit of the MLXG behavior where he goes in a little too deep, but I think it's happening less. I think he's more sure of himself. I think having Mata and the way that him and Mata were working together to facilitate Whoosh was working really, really well. So I think that he's done a very good job, especially against someone like Fire Loli, who's extremely inexperienced. He didn't really seem to understand what he was doing. MLXG showed up really, really well. And I think that Looper and Mata having the synergy, because we talked a little bit about how last year Looper didn't have the same teleport calls. Almost every top laner Mata has played with has been praised for his teleport calls, but I think that having the and not to, I'm not ragging at Spawn, but he mentioned that he was surprised that there was a jungle, that they didn't start Insect because of how important the jungle support synergy is. I think we're also starting to see more 2v2s, so less like it really, really frequent roaming with the support in the jungle together. And just the value of having a jungler who can communicate with one person in every single lane, which is what we see on Royal Never Give Up with MLXG as a Chinese jungler, I think is stronger right now than support and jungle synergy.
But wouldn't he be unable to communicate with Looper, since Looper is Korean?
Oh, right. Excuse me.
No, but I understand
you
the
know what I
idea
mean.
of what you're saying is that if you have, a Chinese top laner, Chinese mid laner, and either a Chinese support or AD carry, having a Chinese jungler, you'd be able to communicate with at least a single piece in every single lane, is what you're suggesting.
Right now, he has 2 lanes you can communicate with, which as opposed to if we had a Korean jungler and a Korean support, we'd have 1 lane. So I think this is still valuable.
I think it's also an interesting point that you kind of beg the question of, the duo between support jungle versus the duo between top support, especially for how the top laners are currently being used in the meta and the type of champions and the power of those champions available. I think Spawn said on the broadcast that he was surprised that the games weren't so much up to the jungler, although MLXG did play a very big role in kind of snowballing RNG ahead, but more so about the top lane's power,
Right.
not only in the players up there, but also the champions. I mean, we saw that in the last series of OMG versus Vici when Long really started going on that trundle, so it might speak to the power there of having Looper and Mata on sync, just because Looper right now has so many powerful champions available to him.
And I think the position of the top laner on the map and where they're exerting the pressure is very important. And also, teleport is
Structure-based
actually
game. Top laner's going to have a lot more impact over that than the jungler.
right. And teleport also is just huge still. Like, we even saw in NEST, Mata ran support, teleport support. So just we're seeing double teleports, maybe triple teleports at some point in rare instances. So I think that
Don't
having
bring
a
me back to Worlds.
having a support that can communicate with the top laner and say, okay, we're gonna snowball through bot and get our AD carry ahead and get this first turret, I think is really, really valuable also.
Okay, so let's now move on to our final series of the night. It was OMG versus Vici. Now, first and foremost, where would you rank either of these teams?
I think Vici Gaming is kind of, they might be. So going into this, I would say that Vici Gaming and I think
RNG?
RNG were kind of similar level. I would say that RNG has the highest ceiling. Vici Gaming, maybe of the three, had the lowest in my mind. I don't really know what to make because I expected OMG to be like a bottom two or a bottom three team.
Why?
So just because we have, first of all, very, very unpracticed talent. The infrastructural changes that they made haven't inspired a lot in terms of their coaching staff, haven't really inspired a lot of confidence in me. They picked up BSYY, who was LGD's coach last year and who kind of seemed to lose commitment and interest and was eventually replaced. So
you're saying their structure changes, don't have the best track record in terms of success. Obviously, their roster is being completely brought up from nothing. I mean, we have a lot of really unknown players on the roster. Dark, Fishball, SMLZ coming from Masters 3, as well as Five, who was previously amazing, but didn't have, too amazing of a performance last year, to put it lightly. Actually thought he performed well tonight in this series, on his Thresh specifically, but, it was kind of hit and miss, but the philosophy, or at least how you've explained it to me, the philosophy for OMG is that for long-term success in the club and in the LPL, it's to take value in Chinese talent and kind of fostering that development from the ground up, obviously eliminating any sort of communication barrier. So my question to you is, obviously in the short term, that's going to be hard because you're having to build up a completely new team, a completely new synergy. So you expect OMG to struggle in short term. But do you actually think with this roster and with that philosophy, especially as we kind of see the imports like Dandy, Mata being utilized, even Athena seemed really in sync with EDG as, the teams are learning how to work around their foreign imports. Do you actually think that OMG's plan has long-term success to it?
I don't. Like I said, maybe if they had a better leadership in terms of, because Cool isn't really known. He doesn't talk much at all in games. He was like the anomaly of OMG, so he's not gonna really provide as much guidance as the veteran player of the team. And you have a coach who doesn't have the greatest reputation for, fostering talent and growing a team. So just this sort of, if you think about like the core of an infrastructure being who is the coach and who is like the primary veteran player, they just don't have a good setup for growing young talent. I think Vici Gaming has a similar philosophy to OMG, but they have players like Dandy, they have players like Easyhoon, who seem like they'd be better mentors almost if they can communicate with the young players.
Okay. So now kind of speaking specifically to Vici, like you said, they had Mata, they had Dandy, they had these great pillars. Obviously now Mata on RNG, Dandy still retaining his spot on Vici. My question kind of goes to this idea of style. So we saw Vici perform tonight in kind of two very different compositions but very similar styles. I think they won in different ways, but it was still kind of textbook and very clinical about how they played around the map and being a very objective oriented team. And Vici does that despite losing pretty much every single member. I mean, their two retaining members from last split are going to be Endless, the AD carry, and Dandy, who's moved back into the jungle from the top position, but they lost Mata. They're not using the same mid laner. They're not using, obviously they don't have World 6 or carry, but they somehow still retain their identity and refined it. So that would lead me to believe that Dandy is the shot caller, although I thought it was Mata on Vici. So how do you think a team retains their exact identity and almost perfects it, despite the fact that they have a completely different roster?
There are a couple points on this. First of all, as Mata started becoming frustrated, Dandy took over a lot of the communication on Vici last year. So he actually was a big part of their communication and their leadership and decision making last year. The other aspect to consider, though, is that if you see players who play together, the type of calls or gameplay that the team ends up, if those players like break off and become shot callers or leaders of other teams, you can see similar threads. For example, on WE, we had Wei Xiao, who was originally the shot caller of the classic lineup of Sao Mei, Clearlove, Messiah, Wei Xiao, and FCZF. And then what he kind of took a step back from that role, and Messiah took over, and the team was still similar in that regard. And then you had Clearlove and FCZF break off, and FCZF handled a lot of the communication and the shot calling in the 2014 EDG. And they had a very similar still farm and teamfight late game kind of style. And this role eventually passed on to Clearlove, and we see echoes of that even in some of the aggressive iterations of EDG now. So I think that you can...
So you think this has just been passed down to Dandy in terms of his responsibility on Vici?
To an extent. I also think that because those players kind of developed a synergy and a style that controlled the way Samsung White worked, for example, that they both kind of probably have a very similar philosophy of how the game should be played.
Okay, that's fair. In terms of kind of dissecting how Vici win or what their core components are, obviously you have standout players like Dandy, like EasyHoon. Your three Chinese players then are going to be Long in the top lane, who's a pickup from Unlimited Potential, Endless, and then formerly known as Dwan, now known as Caveman for their support position. Who do you think, like, if you had to identify what the key of success or key to success was for RNG, what is the key to success for Vici?
So I think that it's ending up being similar, just because we have, and going, I was a little bit more surprised by Looper on Royal, but this is kind of the Vici Gaming I expected, where the goal is to get Long ahead, because Long, I think, had played both utility and carry style on Unlimited Potential, but I think the team in general was more successful when he played more carry style champions, like his Fizz, things like that, his Hecarim. So I think that right now the team's best bet is to kind of get him ahead, because EasyHoon is going to create a very nice control point in the middle of the map. That's always been his playstyle. So that gives Dandy a lot of freedom to work along the map, to decide which lanes to emphasize on either side, these sorts of things. So I think that getting Long ahead, allowing him to set up those teleport plays with their bottom lane, and to have him split pushing with vision provided by Dandy or vision provided by EasyHoon is going to be a really, really strong strategy, a strong focus for them going forward.
So enabling Long to play his kind of dual threat and allow him to be a very flexible piece for the team. I also want to talk about Dandy, playing Graves in that second game and stepping up into this role of being kind of a hard carry. I mean, one of the issues with looking at the Vici roster is you say, who is the primary carry for this roster? And you've now identified for Long, but I want to throw it. Do you think that in terms of how this works, if you have control mage or control point EasyHoon mid, you have Dandy as your kind of carry, especially if he's going to be playing things like Graves in the jungle. You have Long, who can go off and be your split pusher, kind of your distraction. And then you kind of have a janitorial bot lane. Is that kind of the identity that Vici have taken on?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that Dandy was developing more of this like teamfight oriented carry style at the beginning of last year too, before Vici kind of fell off the rails.
Okay, and last and final question, and it's going to be about OMG. Now that you've kind of seen OMG's new roster, obviously they have TBQ signed as the jungler, so we'll see if they choose to sub in TBQ between him and Fishball. What do you think is salvageable from that roster? If you had to pick someone other than Cool that you would kind of continue forward. Because, Dark looked a little bit off with his teleport timings that really cost OMG in several key plays. Cool looked a little sporadic. I actually thought Fishball did decent given the tools that were available to him.
Right. I think the problem with having an inexperienced jungler like Fishball is just because of how important it is to understand vision, to understand how the map works, things like that. So it's on a roster where you're so lacking in experience and guidance and generally macro play or developed talent or anything, it's really hard to run that. So they can try TBQ. I know TBQ at least talks. So, and he has worked with PYL, who was had a pretty strong like understanding of the game. So if he can communicate that somehow, I doubt it a little bit, just because we know TBQ has issues with decision making. The other thing that I would look at is I really would like to see them play North again. I think SMLZ did well on Misfortune. I was surprised. But I think that North might provide for them a little bit more power during the laning phase. The other So I think Amazing is good. This is a good meta for him just because he's always been like this engage based guy. I don't really like his Alistar, but his Thresh and Annie have always been pretty strong. So 5 or Amazing is fine. So these are the pieces that I would kind of look at. Top lane is going to be a pain point for them just because I don't think either the top laners on their rosters right now are very strong players.
Okay. Cool. Thank you so much for your time. Again, we'll be doing reactionary play pretty much following the LPL every single day, so 4 episodes per week. Kelsey, any last thoughts?
I'm excited to watch the matches tomorrow. We have QG versus LGD, so that should be pretty good.
Awesome. I'm Froskurinn. This is Kelsey. Thank you so much.